And what I want to do in this video is I want to go over this article that I did a few weeks ago called, "Is Zelensky Really a Dictator Without Elections?" Now, let me say up front that this article was controversial. I had some people that really liked it, some people that really hated it. So I thought I would go through it. I'm not going to read it word for word, but I'm going to read through some of it. And there are a lot of embedded videos in the article that I thought I would point you to. And I'll put the link to the article down below so that you can see it. Okay, so first of all, here is the article. And let's go to this window here. Is Zelensky really a dictator without elections? Okay, this was back over a month ago that I did this, actually close to 2 months ago. This has to do with a post that Donald Trump did on Truth Social. And in the post, he said that, think of it, a modestly successful comedian, Volodymyr Zelenskyy, talked the United States into spending $350 billion to go into a war that couldn't be won. So right away, there's Trump with his usual bombast and hyperbole. I don't think it was any near close to 350 billion. I don't know where he gets that number, but he said the war never had to start, but a war that he, without the US and Trump, will never be able to settle. The United States has spent $200 billion more than Europe, and Europe's money is guaranteed, while the United States will get nothing back. Why didn't sleepy Joe Biden demand equalization, and that this war is far more important to Europe than to us? We have a big, beautiful ocean, and so on and so on. So finally, he says, a dictator without elections. Zelensky better move fast if he's not going to have a country left. Okay, so that's like the question that I want to examine here. Is Zelensky really a dictator without elections? So he brought a huge backlash from the media and so on, including even many people in Trump's own party. And then, so, what is he? Is he Winston Churchill? Is he a dictator? What is he? I wanted to show you this post-victory propaganda piece. This was Volodymyr Zelensky back in 2019 after he won the presidency. And as you probably know, he was a TV actor, comedian, who had a very successful show called Servant of the People. And so he produced this, how long is this? This is about an hour-long commercial for TV.
Хвилин до Нового року я вам дещо пообіцяю. І одразу виконаю. Я іду в президенти України.
Привет, как дела? Серьезный день, ребята. Ти можеш піти в політику, стати політиком, але при цьому залишитись людиною.
Так, я готовий.
Дебати відбудуться перед народом України.
Даю вам 24 години. Думай.
So you can see he looks a lot different from just 4 years ago, or actually 6 years ago. So he came to power in 2019. He replaced the very corrupt and unpopular Petro Poroshenko. So a diminutive former comedian, he promised to end the civil war in Donbas, which started in 2014 after the Euromaidan color revolution that overthrew Ukrainian President Viktor Yanukovych. He also promised to fight corruption. He won with very high percentages of votes against his opponent in the second round, 75 to 25%. So a lot of people don't know this, but he was heavily supported by ethnic Russians and Russian speakers in the east and south of Ukraine who wanted to end the war. Poroshenko was then indicted for corruption. So I was surprised by this, as many other people were, but I thought, well, he's a lot like Trump. He's a populist. He's a guy on TV who never held office before. So it's very similar to this whole populist wave that we see that's happening throughout the world. And many wondered if he could herald the reform of Ukraine's rampant corruption. Just to provide some context, and I'll try to go through this quickly because it's uber complicated, but Ukraine began as a nation state in 1991. Their first president was Leonid Kravchuk. Their second president was Leonid Kuchma. That went on for from 1991 all the way until 2005. Now, both of these people were former Soviet apparatchiks, and they knew very little about the free market. And so through a combination of incompetence and corruption, they let about 40% of Ukraine's wealth fall into the hands of 7 billionaire oligarchs. I have a little footnote here that goes over it. There's different statistics here, but that's a conversation I had with a friend of mine back in 2007 who was telling me about this. There are 7 people that control all the wealth in Ukraine, or 50% of it, he said. And I found out that that was basically correct. Okay, so the 4 popularly elected presidents after Kuchma, now this was after, 14 years of mismanagement, misrule, the rise of an oligarchy. And each president after that came to power promising to put an end to the oligarchy and get rid of corruption. So you have Viktor Yushchenko, who he helped to enrich corrupt oligarchs after promising reform. You had Viktor Yanukovych, who succeeded Yushchenko, and he was sponsored by oligarchs who helped him win the election. So was Volodymyr Zelenskyy. We'll find out in a minute. And then Petro Poroshenko came to power after Yanukovych was overthrown, and he was a billionaire oligarch himself. Okay, and this is a little brief history of corruption in the Ukraine era. These are several good articles, and it gives all of the data and background information on the names of the different billionaires who were enriched by Yushchenko, including Kolomoisky, who was the oligarch who put Volodymyr Zelenskyy into power. So this is a pretty good website here. People are going to say it's biased, of course, because it's talking about the corruption in Ukraine, but I found that pretty much it's something that basically just chronicles all the corruption in the country. So you can judge it on its own merit. So corruption's also plagued the prime ministers and other Ukrainian officials, including another billionaire oligarch named Yulia Tymoshenko, who is the prime minister under Yushchenko. So what happens is that these presidents will go out of power, and then their successors will have them indicted. Tymoshenko, she was the only one high-ranking official who actually was put in prison, but there are many others who have been put in prison, a lot of Zelensky's rivals and so on. U.S. President Joe Biden also came under scrutiny for his dealings with one of Ukraine's largest gas companies, Burisma Holdings. And the allegations against Biden emerged due to the association of his son, Hunter Biden, with Burisma and its owner, Mykola Zlochevsky, who was Ukraine's ecology minister under former President Yanukovych before he was forced into exile. So according to Ukrainian authorities, Zlochevsky was suspected of theft of government funds on an especially large scale. This is an amazing article. This was in the New York Times. So prior to 2022, prior to the Russian invasion, there were literally all sorts of articles in the mainstream media about the corruption in Ukraine. So this is not something that's controversial. This is a well-known fact. The most corrupt country in Europe, one of the most corrupt countries in the world. Enter Zelenskyy the showman. I'm going to show you this little video here. This is from, you can watch this show on Netflix.
If you don't know yet, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy was an actor and comedian once. And so he did a comedy series called Servant of the People. And the Zelenskyy starrer Servant of the People is now back on Netflix after repeated requests from fans. The OTT platform writes on Twitter and announces, and I quote here, "You asked and it's back. Servant of People is once again available on Netflix in the United States." The 2015 satirical comedy series stars Volodymyr Zelenskyy playing a teacher who unexpectedly becomes president after a video of him complaining about corruption suddenly goes viral. The show has 3 seasons which ran from 2016 to 2019. And obviously the series helped launch Zelenskyy's real-life political career. This series is said to have inspired his political plunge. He was elected president of Ukraine in 2019 in a huge landslide victory. The show has now come back on demand since the Ukraine-Russia war began. And since then, demand...
So I've actually watched part of the first season of this. It's a kind of interesting show. What happened was he got involved with this oligarch, Igor Kolomoisky, who at one time was one of the richest men in Ukraine, if not the richest. He was a former mafia boss and the governor of the Dnipropetrovsk Oblast, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. And he helped Zelenskyy found this media empire and a number one sitcom called Servant of the People. The premise is about a high school history teacher whose students post a video of him ranting about the corruption in the country that goes viral. And then a grassroots-led petition wins him a spot on the presidential ballot. Coming out of nowhere, he becomes president and fights corruption. So I've got the actual link here. If you have Netflix, you can go there and watch it if you can, if you're interested in that kind of a thing. So the irony here is deep because you have an example of entertainment and reality. You have, it's not a reality show, it's an actual sitcom. And then you have real life imitating art. So art imitates life, life imitates art. It's an amazing phenomenon of the modern world. So this is what happened after Zelenskyy won the election. Now remember, he came to power promising that he was going to fight corruption and that he was just like his TV character, and everyone believed this because, of course, he's the TV character. He's the comedian everyone knows and loves. It would be like if Jerry Seinfeld ran for president, and people were that cynical about corruption that they wanted a Jerry Seinfeld because they know that he would, deal with the corruption cynically. So the first thing he did when he came to power was he found out that Igor Kolomoisky was indicted for corruption. The very guy that helped him come to power, that funded a lot of his campaign and so on, was indicted by the United States. Okay? And basically, just in a nutshell, he founded a bank in Ukraine and then was indicted on a conspiracy to basically skim billions of dollars off of accounts from this bank very blatantly, and he thought he could get away with it, and the United States stopped him because he started buying up land in the United States. Very blatant and kind of amazing that this happened. So he loses the support of the richest and one of the most powerful politicians in the country, Igor Kolomoisky. Then what I believe, I'll just cut to the chase here. I believe what happened from there is that the nationalists who were supportive of Poroshenko got to him and said, well, now you have to do what we tell you to do. That's my theory. I'll get into that later. But this is what Zelenskyy did after he came into office. He banned any suspected pro-Russian opposition parties, such as Opposition Platform for Life, and he left only the Ukrainian nationalist parties in power. He banned all opposition media. He strengthened the ban on Russian language and culture. He even removed literary grades such as Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, and Pushkin from the education curriculum, and great composers such as Shostakovich and Tchaikovsky from the National Theater. So Ukraine and Russia has this great tradition of sponsoring the arts. So you can go for just a few dollars and watch an opera, for example, in downtown Kiev. I actually saw an opera by Shostakovich called Katerina when I was there. And so people are very steeped in this culture, and Zelenskyy just decided to cancel the Russian culture in Ukraine. Then more recently, he banned the 1,000-year-old Ukrainian Orthodox Church, claiming that the clergy were spies for Russia due to their ties to the Moscow Patriarchy. And this is something that a lot of my friends believe, the people that are very pro-Ukraine. They'll say, well, no, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, they are spies for Russia, and these people are, even the people who are the priests who claim they were loyal to Ukraine and had no evidence against them. He just banned their religion outright. And then he even issued a decree making it illegal for him as the president of Ukraine to negotiate the end of the war with Putin. So let me tell you a couple of things about that. The decree is reversible. He doesn't have to follow it. He could pick up the phone today and call Russia and start negotiating with Putin. But Zelenskyy often resorts to evasion, saying, no, I passed a law saying negotiation was impossible. But he was the one that decreed the law. So not ending martial law and calling for elections is the only way for Zelenskyy to stay in office. This is the reason why Trump called him a dictator. There were several recent polls. When I wrote this article, this was before Trump's blow up in the White House, and then Zelenskyy got some of his popularity back, but his popularity was falling, and Valery Zelenskyy was leading him in polls for the presidency by a wide margin. So in 4 of the recent polls, you can see here that you find Zelenskyy over here at 30%, 37%, 36%, 42%, 41%, and so on. And Zelenskyy has come up recently after Trump got to him, got him in a yelling match in the Oval Office. But it's very possible that if Zelenskyy ran for president again, he'd lose in the first round, and then it would be a runoff between Zelenskyy and who knows who else. I mean, who knows who else. So I mentioned that here. There was a recent poll that favored Zelenskyy was taken after the famous dust-up with Trump. There's been a few others since that. So Zelenskyy, he was a guy who was relieved from being commander of Ukrainian armed forces because he criticized Zelenskyy, saying the war had become a stalemate at best and Ukraine should negotiate with Russia. Now, Zelenskyy is not pro-Russian. He's very much a nationalist. As a matter of fact, he admires the Ukrainian nationalists who were, I won't say it on YouTube, but the mustache people, let's put it that way. And he has a picture of Stepan Bandera, who was this ultranationalist leader during World War II that fought with the Germans against the Soviet Union. And there's a whole history about that. I'm not going to get into it in this particular report, though. But he was blamed in a Wall Street Journal report for the explosion of the Nord Stream pipeline sabotage, which is ridiculous because there's really no evidence that he was behind it. It was probably the United States and another actor like Norway or Poland or someone like that. But they say it was Zelenskyy in Poland that did that. So they kind of like they tried to blame him and disparage him so that he couldn't become president. But then he was promoted to be ambassador to Great Britain. So kind of a cushy job, but Great Britain is one of Ukraine's best allies. So, so this is another video from the BBC, which is not, pro-Russian at all. They're very anti-Russian, very pro-Ukrainian. And there are 52% of Ukrainians, when I wrote this article, want to end the war and negotiate with Russia. Only 32 wanted to continue. And of course, that sample actually excludes the Russian population in the 5 oblasts that have already acceded to Russia. Now that's about, 10 or 11% of the population has already left Ukraine, either gone to another country, gone into Russia, or they've left with the countries that seceded and acceded to Russia. So that's the poll of the remaining people who are supposedly for Ukraine. 52% want them to end the war. And so now they have to get recruiters. The recruiters were previously taking bribes to allow conscripted men to keep out of the military. Those people have been fired and indicted for corruption. And now Zelenskyy has recruiters who literally pull people out of cars and send them to the front lines with a little training. I have a friend on Facebook who publishes like a new video every week on, the most recent Ukrainian being pulled out of a car and being drafted. This is just one.
Ukraine is facing one of its most perilous chapters since the start of Russia's full-scale invasion, with Moscow's offensive getting ever more intense. The Ukrainian army desperately needs to enlist more troops, but more than 2 years into the war, is struggling to find willing volunteers.
These are interviews.
Our correspondent Jean McKenzie reports from the city of Odessa.
At Sergei's wedding, it wasn't just the weather that didn't go to plan. Half of the guests didn't show up.
This is a...
Public transport has become a no-go for those trying to avoid the draft. Conscription officers have a fearsome reputation for dragging people off buses and taking them to conscription centres.
So this is the BBC. This is not an anti-Ukrainian media outlet at all. They're very much anti-Russian and very much pro-Ukrainian. Even they're admitting that they have to resort to, going after draft dodgers now. And there's lots of different, these are lots of different lots of different little clips here, and so on. Throughout the first 2 years of the war, American journalist and successful novelist Gonzalo Lira exposed much of this information to Americans on social media, mostly through a YouTube channel and also on several other social media platforms. He lived in the city of Kharkiv in eastern Ukraine. He was married to a woman from Kharkiv. And he was strangely allowed to do this for over 2 years. He was occasionally questioned by Ukraine's SBU. He was not arrested, but he was detained and questioned a few times. At least once he had a video of it that he posted that happened. And then he was arrested for justifying he was arrested for justifying the Russian invasion. His trial was delayed. He was later released, and then SBU agents caught him at the border of Hungary trying to leave the country. So this is Gonzalo Lira. He posted this to Twitter, X, right before he, we'll see what happens here.
What happened to Gonzalo Lira? Well, for posting that video and others like it, he was arrested by the government of Ukraine, the one that we pay for. And then he was let out, and then he tried to leave the country.
I will definitely be sent to a prison labor camp where I will most certainly die. And my intention is to cross the border and get to Hungary. In Hungary, I'm going to ask for political asylum. So either I will cross the border into Hungary in the next couple of hours, or I will be arrested again, and God knows what will happen to me.
He never made it. 5 miles from the Hungarian border, 5 kilometers rather, from the Hungarian border, he was arrested. The Biden State Department is uninterested in the fate of this American citizen. In fact, of course, they support his imprisonment, and no one in the national media seems interested in his fate whatsoever.
So there are people that did speak out about this, and they tried to get extradition back, or not extradition, but just try to get his release back to America because he's an American citizen. So this is kind of chilling that there's an American citizen who's just giving their opinion on social media, and he's arrested, and he was beaten, he contracted pneumonia, and he died in prison. And no one did anything to try to free him when Biden was questioned about it, claimed he knew nothing about it, which is ridiculous that the State Department would not know anything about an American arrested in Ukraine. So this is what's been going on with Zelensky. So a dictator without elections. If Zelensky wanted to, he could ask the Rada, which is their parliament, open election, allow a slate of candidates on the ballot. He could ask the Rada to negotiate a ceasefire with Russia while they held elections for a few days or a week. And, you could have campaign going on during the war, but just like during this week, stop the fighting, and the Russians would likely want that legal opportunity to get Zelensky out of the way, or not. And then if they didn't agree to that, he'd have an excuse. But there's no attempt to even want to stand for election. All right, the same powers that be, the same oligarchs and nationalists that control Zelensky also control the leaders in the Rada too. So people who defend Zelensky as this hero, they see a little piece of the picture. But when you look at the whole story from beginning to end, you see that he's one in the line, starting with Kravchuk, and then Kuchma, and then Yushchenko, then Yanukovych, and then Poroshenko, and then Zelensky, all corrupt Ukrainian presidents. So Ukraine's not this free democratic nation. It was originally a socialist republic of the former Soviet Union. It was never a country before that. There was a brief period of time in 1919, where they tried to do this Hungarian project where they make Ukraine into a state, but it was not viable. And then throughout the years of the Soviet Union, there were parts of Russia, Hungary, Romania, and Poland were added to this heartland that was populated by Ukrainians. It was always known as, the Ukraine, which means the borderland, okay? And this enlargement of the Ukrainian Socialist Republic was part of the USSR, and that occurred between 1921 to 1954. In 1991, Ukraine declared itself an independent nation just before the Soviet Union dissolved. Now, I'm not saying that Ukraine shouldn't be recognized internationally. It was, and it is a sovereign country, but from the beginning, what you have to understand is it's not really a sovereign nation internally. It's not controlled by the people, it's controlled by a corrupt oligarchy. And so Zelensky is not this hero. He's basically an actor, he's a clown, he's dancing on the end of marionette strings. Okay? He's controlled by the mafia and by these oligarchs. and nationalists. So the big question that people ought to ask, and most people have never heard of Igor Kolomoisky, but we ought to ask, like, why was Kolomoisky arrested in the first place? Since all of these other oligarchs have had pretty much, free reign when they were president. So it's a mystery as to why he was quickly indicted after Zelensky's election. Besides fighting corruption, one of Zelensky's two main promises was to bring the Donbas civil war begun in 2014 to a swift end. He even mentioned being willing to visit Moscow for direct negotiations during his campaign. Polls at the time showed that most Ukrainians wanted to see that accomplished quickly. There had already, by that time, by 2019, there had been 14,000 people on both sides of the conflict that had died, including many civilians, mainly on the Russian side, but also on the Ukrainian side too. So it was like a civil war going on where a lot of people were dying. And there were at least a couple of thousand civilians who died among that 14,000. So it's a mystery as to why this mandate from the Ukrainian people to end the war was so promptly and egregiously ignored. However, the following are several possibilities. These are several explanations. Okay, first, the initial indictments of Kolomoisky didn't come from Kiev, but it came from the United States, after it was discovered that Kolomoisky acquired property in the United States using funds illegally obtained from Privatbank in Ukraine as part of a multi-billion-dollar fraudulent loan scheme. And here's the article on that right here, which I'm not going to read, but this is from the U.S. U.S. Department of Justice. And this goes back to January 2022. Okay, and it's taken a very long time. Kolomoisky was indicted back in 2019, but hasn't come to trial yet. Interesting. Second, Zelenskyy was no longer beholden to Kolomoisky, who could have acted as his protector from Poroshenko's supporters in the Euromaidan government. The people who wanted to keep the civil war going, the people who wanted to eliminate all things Russia. And like I said, these people are ultra-nationalists. The Banderites, the Azov battalion, there's numerous other battalions that have this neo-nationalist bent to them, who literally do want to eliminate all things Russian. Not everyone in Ukraine is like that, but there's a percentage of the population that supports that. So the Rada at this point consisted of many nationalists who are not going to stomach any pro-Russian concessions. Now the pressure on Zelenskyy to keep the conflict going from both Western neocons in Washington and the Ukrainian Rada was too great. Okay, third, Zelenskyy faced a number of scandals that kept him from cooperating with Trump, who wanted to end U.S. involvement in funding the Donbas civil war. Even though Trump did give javelins and he did fund it, he kind of did that under pressure from the neocons in his own party, like people like Lindsey Graham and Bolton and who's the other guy there? Bolton and anyway. Even before the election, Trump was hit with allegations of Russian collusion and even being a Russian agent, according to the infamous Steele dossier, which has since been thoroughly debunked. And so here's if you don't believe that Trump was a Russian agent, this is a thing from Congress. The Republicans put this together, saying that they were shocked and outraged that this, you can read it. It's just, I think it's ridiculous. I know a lot of my friends who hate Trump, they believed in all of this, but it's been debunked since time. So you had, let's see, John Bolton and who was the other person in Trump's cabinet whose name escapes me at the moment. Someone will put it in the comments, I'm sure, but these were two neocons that Trump had to fire and get rid of them because they were really pushing him towards this every war that he didn't want to get involved in. So 4, Trump wanted to do this, but he faced an impeachment, which stemmed largely from a telephone conversation between the two leaders in 2019. Just after Zelenskyy was elected, Trump tried through both Russian and Ukrainian channels to get to the bottom of the corruption in Ukraine involving U.S. officials, especially Joe and Hunter Biden's involvement with the Ukrainian gas company. So my theory, too, is that it's not just the Bidens, but many people, including Republicans, were involved in this graft. And this is the reason why Trump couldn't do anything about it. So, like I said, Zlochevsky was being investigated by the prosecutor general Shokin, for fraud. And Biden infamously bragged that he had the prosecutor fired using a threat to withhold U.S. aid. So this is, you may have seen this before, but
former top Ukrainian prosecutor who got fired, he came out swinging against Biden, the Bidens, Hunter and Joe Biden. And that was in an exclusive interview with Brian Kilmeade on Saturday night. And Alexandria Hoff is standing.
Anyway, this is the famous, you can look at this, but this is.
I had gotten a commitment from Poroshenko and from Yatsenyuk that they would take action against the state prosecutor, and they didn't. So they said they were.
By the way, that guy Yatsenyuk, I forget how you say his name, but he was the interim president that Victoria Nuland and Kagan and a couple other people, who was it? It was Victoria Nuland and another, during the Obama administration, they had them installed as the leaders of Ukraine over the objections of the EU. That's another story, which I'm not going to get into, but.
The press conference said, I said, we're not going to give you the $1 billion. They said, you have no authority. You're not the president. The president said, I said, call him.
Well, Ukraine did get that $1 billion because Shokin was ousted. So in an interview that's exclusive with Brian Kilmeade, Shokin said that he was not fired for corruption, but because he was overseeing an investigation into Burisma, the Ukrainian national gas company, where Hunter Biden served on its board.
Plans whatsoever, no problems with how.
So you can, I'm not going to play all of this, but you can watch it. There's a famous line by Biden saying that I had the SOB fired.
President Biden, on the final leg of his mission to Europe, he's in Finland this morning after making a pledge of support for.
I'm getting ahead of myself here, but you know, basically you have a large, also number 5 is you have a lot of money that's being funneled through U.S. organizations like USAID to the government-controlled Ukrainian media that continue to put out daily anti-Russian propaganda. Very clownish in times, in my opinion. A lot of people believe it. They just take it literally. Like anything bad about Russia has to be true. So this was a psyop, and it made it, because the Ukrainian media publishes it, it just goes verbatim into the Western media as well. And there are stories appearing in the so-called independent newspapers such as Ukrainska Pravda, were often repeated verbatim in the Western media. Ukrainian Truth. All Kremlin media giving the Russian side, such as Russia Today, were suppressed. So this is Ukrainska Pravda. Here's, you can just look at this. This is a real interesting publication. And you know, Russia has its own propaganda, state-run, Russia Today, which you know, Russia Today is actually I recommend reading Russia Today and reading Ukrainska Pravda and just seeing the two sides. But Russia Today gets suppressed. Like for a while, you couldn't post it on any social media. They would just block it. This is
Ukraine at the NATO summit in Lithuania.
We will not waver. We will not waver. I mean that. Our commitment to Ukraine will not weaken. We will stand for liberty and freedom today, tomorrow, and for as long as it takes.
Elizabeth Schultz is with the president in Helsinki. Good morning, Elizabeth.
Good morning, George. In the final stop of this trip, President Biden is taking a...
So we're going to support Ukraine as long as it takes. The Biden administration had full information from the Pentagon and the CIA as to what the situation on the ground and the Ukraine war was really like. They knew after the first few months that Ukraine would lose militarily, and that was never their goal. The goal was never to defeat Russia militarily. They knew it's a nuclear power. They can't escalate. Russia would see this as an existential threat. They said that very clearly. This is a red line. And so their goal was to crush Russia with sanctions, but it became apparent that that wasn't working. So once they knew the sanctions weren't working, they doubled down and they said, you know, we're winning on the battlefield and we'll support them for as long as it takes. But the objective to win the war was never clearly explained as to what it would look like. Like, what would it look like? You know, would they drive Russia out of Crimea? Would they take over Russian naval bases and submarine bases in Crimea? How would they do that? There's a Sevastopol naval base. There's been a naval base of Russia since 1776 or something like that. This was 1780s, and they have been there for 250 years. And so, you know, what does that look like? Are they going to push Russia out of a port that they've held for, you know, a large part of their existence. Okay, so let's draw a conclusion from all of this. I can believe, I can believe that Zelenskyy might have had the best intentions to end the Donbas war and to fight corruption in Ukraine. But his big liability was Kolomoisky. And then once this corrupt oligarch was out of the way, the nationalist faction seized an opportunity. What better president to deflect against accusations against corruption and neo-Nazi influence, I said that word, than an actor, and a Jewish actor at that. So if you're curious enough and want to follow the truth, if you're open to discovering that you've been lied to about Zelenskyy's rise to power, read the following biography on Igor Kolomoisky on Wikipedia. Okay, I'm not going to read through this, but just read it. I'm telling you, it's very interesting. And this is the man who was largely responsible for putting Zelenskyy into power. Okay, it's an amazing story. Most people know nothing about it. So he was the money behind Zelenskyy's media corporation presidential campaign. People will deny that, but I'm telling you that Zelenskyy got rich because of his association with this man. And this is who Zelenskyy is behind the mask. Kolomoisky's in prison. Zelenskyy turned on his benefactor, and he's been held for many, many months now, even since, I don't know how many years he's been in prison, but he has not had a speedy trial. And almost no one in the media will cover this. Opposition media in Ukraine doesn't exist. Those who do speak out, like Gonzalo Lira, sometimes disappear or are killed. There's many pro-Russian and even neutral journalists who have been assassinated by these ultranationalist thugs in Ukraine. So if the pattern holds, Zelenskyy might soon find himself out of power, facing corruption charges himself. Okay, so that's the video. I'm going to try to do more of this kind of thing coming up in the summer. I have a series on Daniel, and I'll do more videos on Russia, Ukraine. I also have my book called The Fourth Political Theory in Biblical Perspective. You can go to Amazon.com and just type in my name, Jay Rogers. You'll find a bunch of books I did, some of them on eschatology, some of them on apologetics and theology, and the most recent one called The Fourth Political Theory, which I think that you should order, and I'll see you soon.